Hello everybody, welcome to the ELA Learning Alliance on Horizontal Accountability for topic number 2. My name is Pascal Mio. I am your moderator for this topic. In this topic, we are focusing on factors that shape horizontal accountability institutions and determine their effectiveness. We have chosen 4 main determinants of horizontal accountability. The first one is systems of government, basically focusing on parliamentary and presidential systems of government. The second one is incentives, basically formal and informal systems that provide incentives for effective accountability. The third is capacity and capabilities of MPs to provide leadership, management, and representation and exercise their capabilities and capacities to hold the governments accountable. The fourth is political institutions, mainly political parties as controllers of leaders, producers of policy, and institutions that can enforce mechanisms that influence effectiveness of accountability systems. In that context, therefore, we are first going to look at the government systems in terms of the comparison between presidential and parliamentary systems. As most of you know, most of the countries in Africa adopted parliamentary systems at the time of independence, but quickly switched to executive presidential systems. However, in Latin America, most of the countries started with and retained presidential systems. Now, in the executive presidential systems, it is notable that the executive has a lot of powers, including the power to veto legislation, change or block budgets, and in case the executive disagrees with the parliament, the president has power to dissolve the parliament. There is another smaller brand of executive presidentialism, which means with legislative and executive presidentialism, in which the president can even pass decrees alongside laws passed by parliament. So the president also has legislative powers. And an emerging brand of executive presidentialism in Africa now is the element of what we call presidential monarchy, where an executive president starts grooming their children or their spouses in preparation of them to succeed them when they relinquish power. In parliamentary systems, however, there are less powers of the executive. First and foremost, parliament is deemed to be supreme. Secondly, in parliamentary systems, the executive has no veto power over legislation. In most of these parliamentary systems, there is a bicameral system of 2 houses of parliament, and it is only the upper house in some countries which has a veto power over legislation which is coming from a lower house. In addition, in a parliamentary system, the head of state cannot dissolve parliament without agreement with parliament itself. So we would like to provoke you into looking at the impact of horizontal or of these factors on horizontal accountability. Mainly, how do parliamentary systems and the presidential systems affect accountability? In doing that, you may consider, for example, that in presidential systems, the presidency has excessive discretionary powers, and there is more leeway for the president to act than in parliamentary systems. Secondly, you may also want to consider the possibility that where there is a threat of the executive to dissolve parliament in case of disagreement, parliament will be more constrained in the way it deals with the executive. Thirdly, also you may want to look at the nature of political parties when the president has a majority in parliament. It seems, therefore, you find that in such a situation, the dominant party in parliament becomes the presidential party. And this definitely might have an impact on horizontal accountability. Fourth, you may want also to look at the concept of separation of powers. How far is it strengthened or threatened within presidential systems when the president can overrule parliament? In addition, you might want to look at the issue of separation of interests. We think it is higher in parliamentary systems than in presidential systems. Finally, the issue of deadlock. In most cases, the parliament is a contest to an arena of contest between parties, but in parliamentary systems, the deadlock situation is likely to be less possible than in presidential systems. The second determinant we put on the table is incentives for parliamentarians to be more effective and to enforce mechanisms for accountability. We try to approach this from demand and supply factors. On the demand factors, we concentrate on the capability of the electorate to compel the representatives or MPs in parliament to be more forceful and effective in demanding accountability. The arguments we put across which you might consider is that, number one, if the electorate has a right to choose the people it wants, then those chosen become more answerable to the electorate and they can perform their duties in accordance with the agenda of the electorate. If they are chosen by political parties without necessarily the strong involvement of the communities and the citizens, then they become more answerable to the parties. Number two, the right to recall. If the citizens who are choosing the representatives have a right to recall a member from parliament if they sense there is no performance, then the member of parliament will feel more obliged to perform well and demand answers and action and enforce mechanisms for accountability. Number three, it will work better if the citizens or the electorate has more information about the performance of their representatives in parliament. If there is no information or if there are cobwebs about their performance, then the electorate cannot exercise influence on effective accountability. Finally, of course, on these demand side factors is the issue of whether the citizens themselves consider the performance of their parliamentarians as a matter of importance to them, or whether they have other considerations which they consider paramount. This, of course, brings us to the supply side factors. Basically, the other side of the electorate, the relations between the electorate and the MPs. Here, we think that where there is political party dominance in the selection of representatives, the representatives don't see incentives to be more accountable because they may be brought back even if they don't perform well, as long as their party recommends them. Secondly is the perceptions of citizens. Here we distinguish between process and outcome accountability. Our argument is that in process accountability, people will focus on the processes of accountability. In outcome accountability, citizens focus on what the MP brings to the community in terms of projects and resources. The third factor, which is supply driven, is the issue of ethnicity and ethnic cleavages. If the system forces citizens to focus more on the identity of the community and the MP rather than the impact and outcomes of the representation, then the effectiveness of horizontal accountability will be affected. Fourth is the issue of numbers. It is becoming clear that the magic of numbers is being used to create alliances which tend to lead to the tyranny of numbers and water down effective accountability. Finally, on this is the issue of restricted royalty. More likely in Africa than in Latin America, citizens tend to focus more on their own people, and they defend their own representative in case there is a problem, and they don't focus on the problems of delivery. Now, if you look at the two sides, supply and demand sides, on how they affect horizontal accountability, it is possible to conclude on this one that insistence on outcomes rather than processes of accountability promotes less focus on executive accountability. It encourages parochialism and constituency consciousness, and also it promotes chronism and patronage systems, with MPs mainly concentrating on forming alliances with the executive in order to get a share of the budget. The third element is capacity and capabilities of parliamentarians to perform their roles. Everything being equal, the performance of parliamentarians will depend, well, number one, on whether they command trust from citizens, command the trust of fellow MPs and government officials, and if they will be seen in their performance to be fair, balanced, unbiased, and committed. Number two, they have to have clear knowledge of the rules so that it can help them to get correct answers and demand and ensure enforceability of decisions. Three, they have to have clear and reliable sources of information so that they can have prepared evidence-based informed presentations which they can use to demand answers and action. Fourth, they need to be leaders and beacons on ethics and transparency. Five, they have to have clear packaging skills which can help them to shape, articulate, and present their demands and questions in order to avoid shoddy and dodgy answers from the executive. Six, they need to be standing out on principles. Everybody has to believe, the constituency members, their fellow MPs and the government people, they have to know that they are strong on capabilities, on standing on principles, and this will help them to win the support of constituents, fellow MPs, and even the executives. In addition, they need networking capabilities, which can help them to link up with constituents, the media, CSOs, and like-minded state and non-state actors. Finally, they have to have capability to be sensitive to various issues, to prevent their views with consciousness about sensitivities related to ethnicity, gender, disability, and religious and other identities. The last element on which is a determinant is the role of political parties and their contribution to effective horizontal accountability. First, let us look at whether the political parties have in your countries, for example, have clear agendas. Do they have their own ideologies? Do they have competing agendas and competing ideologies? Secondly, you may want to look at issues of membership. If parties have no permanent members, does this tend to affect their capability to design, push, and enforce policies? Third, do they have contacts with their members? In some countries, they do not have such contacts until very close to elections. Number four, are the political parties themselves accountable? Do they have a good record of accountability? And if not, does this affect the way they perceive accountability? And does it affect the role of the MPs, how they enforce issues on accountability? Number five, are they transparent? Are the political parties themselves transparent? Some are very weak on how they select, nominate, and even elect leaders, including their MPs. Number six, the issue of personalities. Most of our political parties, especially in Africa, are dominated by their founders and their funders. And these people, these leaders, are not accountable to anybody. So if a party is not accountable to anybody, all the leaders not unaccountable, can they be part of a process that ensures accountability? Related to that is the issue of party funding. Most of them have problems observing party and election funding rules. They don't account for funding. Can they therefore be able to push for effective accountability? Then, in terms of leadership, you might want to focus on the issue of migrant leadership. In some countries, especially in Africa, there is a high preponderance of leadership migration across parties, and leaders move from one party to another. How does this affect the articulation, the formulation of policies, and the capability of political parties to focus on accountability and accountability outcomes? Finally, you may want also to look at the issue of the whip, the party whip system, does it encourage or suppress freedom of expression? Does it encourage cross-party coalitions in parliament? Is it something which you might want to consider in strengthening horizontal accountability? In conclusion, we would like to point out that these are not the only major factors that shape horizontal accountability. As you all are aware, the Latin American countries present a very wide variety of determinants which may not be sufficiently represented in the 4 elements we have covered. We hope that these variants and variations will be brought about in the discussion, and we look forward to a very fruitful discussion. Thank you and all the best.